All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the Space Sustainability Talks brought to you by the Research Network on Security and Technology in Outer Space. My name is Maximilian Bertamini, and together with Philipp Olbrich from the GIZ, I have the pleasure of hosting today's session, in which we will talk again about all things sustainability and outer space. As a brief organizational point before we get started with the content side of things, I wanted to let you know that we made a little change in the way that we engage with the audience, and in which we allow you guys to pose your questions and comments. And that is, since we are the Space Sustainability Talks, we thought it would be a nice addition to give you the opportunity to engage more or less in person with our panelists. And in order to do that, you just have to post the number 1 in the chat if you want to appear with your camera on and your microphone and actually get to talk to the panelists. Or, since the session will be recorded and we obviously value your privacy, you can simply post the number 2 if you simply want to appear with your microphone but no picture. Of course, you can always anonymously post questions in writing in the chat as well, but we will take the liberty to prioritize those who are willing to step up and actively engage with our panelists, because the ambition of this format is to foster discussions and dialogue across disciplines. So we would very much value if you actively engaged. With that being said, let's turn to why you all are here for today, namely the content of today's session. In the past 2 episodes, we have talked a lot about space sustainability in the context of space debris, which is, of course, a very important challenge in terms of space sustainability. We talked with Tomasz Rozenski from the European Space Policy Institute about European efforts in mitigating space debris. We talked to Rada Popova from the University of Cologne and ESA Aerospace about the international law applicable to space debris and which gaps might need to be overcome in that. But today we want to take a little bit of a different angle. If you think about the concept of sustainability, one notion that frequently pops up is that of meeting the needs of today's generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And this language certainly invokes a couple of questions with regards to who is actually part of those abstract generations. The rather normative language might promise a very inclusive idea of generations in the sense that everybody on planet Earth is part of that, but the practice and the question of whose needs are actually met in practice might tell a very different story. And in order to answer these questions and to take this angle, we are very excited to have on board Christian van Eyck today as our esteemed guest, and I'm happy to introduce him to you now. Christian holds a bachelor's degree cum laude in international justice and an LLM in public international law from the University of Leiden, and previously worked with the International Commission on Missing Persons as well as with the TMZ Asser Institutes on topics like civil society engagement and the legal governance of history. One reason for why we are very excited to have Chris on board today is that, unlike many other people working in the field of outer space issues, who might have sort of blinders on and then be very engaged only with the topics of outer space, Chris has been working in a variety of different fields, from looking at Global South, historical and environmental approaches to outer space. And what he does very well is to sort of zoom out and put outer space issues into context. And this is why I, for sure, am very excited to listen what he has to tell us today. And with that, Christian, you have the floor. We're very excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. Let me just quickly put on timer so I don't lose track. Hi, everyone. I'm going to be talking today about a paper I've been working on based on some research I'm doing that's I've so far called Unstealing the Sky. Just to check, we can all see my screen, yeah? Cool. And the slides, or can we see those?
Not yet.
Oh, I have to share them. Oh, again. Let's do that. Cool. Now we're good?
Perfect, yeah.
Awesome. My presentation is going to follow a brief structure, starting with a chapter called The Promise, then moving on to something called The Problem, and finally the present and the possible, bringing it back to where we are now. And you can follow what I'm doing through that handy progress bar at the top. So let's, without further ado, kick in. Basically, what I've been trying to look into is who does space belong to? And I use that word very consciously because the word belong doesn't just denote physical or legal ownership, but also a sense of community and citizenship and an understanding of each other in a way. So if we go on that premise, a lot of the history of outer space kind of starts at the Outer Space Treaty and moves onwards from there, and may mention the Moon Agreement perhaps and the Benefits Declaration, and sort of ends at that point. That's, to me, kind of a myopic view of things. And in true Star Wars fashion, I thought, why not make a prequel series? I hope it doesn't end up as bad an idea as that one was. But in the sense, there's a lot of history that has not yet been talked about. But let's start with the present. At the moment, the picture of outer space looks very much slanted towards certain countries. The big three, as you could call them, of the US, Russia, and China, have the vast majority of space objects, the vast majority of debris, and the vast majority of active satellites. The entirety of the global south has much less. And in fact, at this point, universities and individuals and amateur owned satellites are starting to creep up on even the global south in its entirety. This seemed a little odd to somebody like to me intuitively, right? Does this really represent the picture that was intended when we created the Outer Space Treaty in the first place? First, before we dive that far back, it is worth kind of pointing out why history matters in international law, which of course is a much deeper conversation, and somebody look up Ann Orford if you need more information on that. But for now, I can say, in general, it can matter either doctrinally or in a normative sense. Doctrinally, of course, treaties are read in light of their context and subsequent practice, and in some cases, their drafting history and circumstances of their conclusion. And in a customary international legal context, custom is formed by state practice, of course, and that includes statements at the General Assembly and other UN bodies. Especially, history can help find out if it's general and consistent and durative in these things that the ICJ has told us that they consider in customary law finding. Of course, that's all sort of one side of things. Normatively, there's a whole nother side of the value of history in international law. And that is this idea that values of the past don't vanish back into the ether. They sort of, they don't hang there either behind us. They really are ideas that are subject to active repression. We are trying and being encouraged to forget certain histories over others, to create a canon of an international legal narrative that fits the current status quo and what we want to do with it. And so that's why the question, what if, can be a very powerful one, because it allows us to reshape the present or recontextualize it, and then therefore present a new future entirely. Okay, that's all premise. Let's start with the law. Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty is pretty much the entirety of what I focus on, and is more or less the, in my opinion, central turning point of what makes space a global commons. Of course, there's non-appropriation and Article 3 and all of the rest, but for now, let's focus on this. The first article of the Outer Space Treaty was among its most contentious and does two things that seem to be in tension with each other. On one hand, it has this idea of free use of space, that it should be used by anyone and everyone without restriction. And on the other hand, that idea that it should be used equitably, without necessarily disadvantaging states in the global south. This province of all mankind idea has also been quite contentious. Now, the problem here is that Outer Space Treaty Article 1 has largely been read in a very specific way. The so-called orthodox reading of this article so far has been to read the free use of space as a rule and the equitable use of space as a principle. And sort of the distinction isn't exactly clear why. It becomes a bit more clear when you look at the drafting history of these ideas and specifically who was fighting for them. Equitable use was an idea that was largely thrown in there by Brazil and Argentina, actually, in the UNCLOS meetings. Free use was largely an idea that was championed by the United States and the global north. So this becomes a bit, invites a different reading of this article, by which we can assess this, kind of these two competing values, this spectrum, not as rule and principle, but as a battlefield. And that's sort of the principal argument I make, is that we have to read Article 1 as a site of hegemonic contestation, as a place where North and South fought armed with values to try and ascertain what sort of future that they would be able to get in space for themselves. To balance these values, a promise was made that, exactly as Article 1 presents it, equity would always be the prime norm that would limit freedom, rather than being one hard law and one soft law concept in sequence. It would be a balance. This was something that Manfred Laux was very clear about as the treaty was signed. And there's pretty clear, Oscar Schachter was running around everywhere saying the same, even as of the 50s. Now, here we come to the problem. And this is that during negotiations on this article, we started throwing around a certain term, res communis, which itself is not a legal rule. In fact, it's only a container for rules when you think about it from an international legal context. How you use it and what you mean by it very much shapes the meaning it's given. Itself alone is about as binding as a Harry Potter spell, and in fact sounds like one. As debates continued, they began to toss around this term with very different connotations, and it became kind of a catch-all for everything in the middle of these two values. This is a problem because the Global South saw res communis and the global commons in a very different way from the Global North. In fact, they saw law itself differently. We have to point out that between the first satellite and the first space treaty's conclusion, the Global South's population of states increased by half. Between the start of the ad hoc committee on the peaceful uses of outer space and the first expansion of the formal one in 1961, in that 4-year period, Africa doubled in UN membership and became the most populous bloc of any continent. And at the same time, there was intense collaboration Africa, Asia, and Latin America, culminating in conferences all over the place, Bandung, Accra, Belgrade, and all of this kind of collaboration was really a history of the space kind of debates. It isn't mentioned too much, but in fact, in 1964 in the Cairo Declaration, space was part of the discussion. Now, specifically, Latin America seemed to take a very principles first approach to the space commons, seeing the issue as one that was justice-centric. On the other hand, African states largely were not represented in UNCLOS till after the space treaty was signed. In fact, only 3 were ever part of it before then, and really only the UAE was an active member in that discussion. But they, at the time in sub-Saharan Africa, had millions, thousands of different ways of representing communal ownership and management of lands. I've looked into Ubuntu as one such example, and could have presented alternative views to how a commons could be discussed if they had been able to. And finally, we need to point out that this whole res communis problem was not unseen at the time. Peruvian Representative Bella Unde, who was just off of his shift as the president of the UNGA, was pretty explicit that he said, I want to use this term defined in a certain way that transcends the traditional Roman law concepts, that includes ideas like equity and environmental preservation and communal jurisdiction, if not international communal rights. The problem persisted, though, and res communis as an idea became a very indeterminate term. On one hand, the Global North's idea discussed space as common property, limited the free use of space, limited the free use of space, and the Global North, in contrast, was much more on common access and on codifying that idea. And these last 4 kind of points in each column are the ones I really want to focus on. Specifically, the ideas of equity, environmental preservation, global governance, and collective rights. All of these are core elements of what we would later call the common heritage of mankind. But that history usually only starts either with a guy named Pardo or the Moon Treaty, if ever. These ideas have a longer history, though, and specifically equity, which I'm here to talk about, was an idea very much linked to colonial recovery for the Global South. They were very explicit in saying the science that's enabled you to get to space and the resources that got you there are both things that were taken from us. This was linked to environment pretty heavily as well, in the sense of a lot of the countries who are active in the UNGA talking about space, because they couldn't be in the main meetings, had just seen firsthand the costs of a colonial power grab and what it can do to a territory environmentally. And then the global governance and collective rights issues were sort of a discussion amongst Latin American states on how we should manage a commons. Should it be an international organization that's set up to do so, or should it be an issue in which mankind or humanity has those rights? And that was a kind of Brazil-Argentina conflict there. The problem is the global north very much did not take these on hand and stayed within their definition that was much definitionally thinner. In the end, this balance was a lot heavier on one side than the other. And again, the global south lost out. Here's where we come to the present and the possible. I want to specifically focus on three core questions. Whose law gets to be universal? Whose law gets to be binding? And whose history gets to be remembered? When we talk about whose law gets to be universal, we can look at, for instance, the property panic, as I've called it, which is as soon as Sputnik went up, the global north, and especially the United States, began claiming property on the moon. So many letters were sent to the Department of Interior that the Department of Interior had to draft one of its first ever form response letters to handle that, which of course the South African Daily Mail, Rand Daily Mail published in full, very tongue-in-cheekly. The Northern understanding of property, of fee simple, became the touchstone for the discussion about communal ownership. But the global South was very much not talking about that at all. We were locked into a discussion of property based on one very specific understanding of it. We can talk about talking about whose law gets to be binding, the idea of non-binding declarations from the global North, such as the Artemis Accords, claiming to have an impact on the law of space itself. Whereas declarations from the global South, like the Benefits Declaration, have been the product of decades of discussion and still are seen as non-binding law. Finally, we can talk about, penultimately, we can talk about the fact that in forums where the global South has a majority, like the UNGA, space resolutions have a sort of clause in the preamble that prevents them from impacting custom or subsequent practice. Whereas where the global North can dominate, like in space itself, US practice is pretty much considered standard. Finally, the ultimate question here is why and how have we let one specific country's understanding of the commons, namely the US's, become the touchstone for the rest of the world? And specifically, I want to talk about the way that US policy has changed to try and cover this issue. And I'll kind of end briefly after this. The idea that space was meant to be a commons in the thicker global South sense was one that initially the United States and the global North readily endorsed. And in fact, countries like Austria and the Netherlands were very active in debating this on the global South side, same with Italy. This specifically, I can point to a report by Evan Galloway, who of course is a very well-known name or should be within space law, which outwardly defended this idea of a res communis plus. Then there's, of course, active speeches by Lyndon Johnson is just one of them, in which they were very explicit from a policy standpoint that space would be an area of joint adventure that would belong to all mankind. This is not the picture or the future that we live in today. Now, the United States has adopted a policy as described by Scott Pace, whose name is S. Pace. That can't be, that's a funny coincidence. In which he is outwardly saying space is not a global commons or a res communis or even a public good at all. And they've never been. Apparently that's a consistent policy, he said at the Galloway Space Symposium. This executive order is sort of the culmination of all of this, that space is not apparently meant to be a commons at all. In a sense, this is the formal breaking of the promise of Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, which of course, because we don't remember, doesn't seem at all to be a big change. Now, the kind of thing I want to end on here is what's possible, because I've talked about the past for 15 minutes now and could probably talk again for another 40. But what we can do now practically is try and remember the histories that were forgotten on purpose earlier, and most importantly is make them relevant in the now. So for this, I propose 3 touchstones that I'll come back to in the questions if anybody wants to know more about. 3 proposals for how we might kind of reuse, recycle, or continue on the proposals by the Global South in the space debates of the 50s and 60s. Namely, the idea of space as an area that is part of the environment and protected by environmental law and things like EIAs, which may seem crazy or would have 5 years ago, but there is currently a case in the DC Court of Appeals on this issue. The idea of LEO as a limited resource that has to be dealt with sustainably and equitably, which is there in the ITU convention, but seems to be still not widely accepted, or LEO still is not managed in the same way. And the idea of environmental rights in orbit, continuing this idea of international management. To finalize my point here, my 3 main points are that Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty is a battlefield that should be read as hegemonically contesting ideas we've still not put down. Today's space commons were made because we silenced and sidelined the views of the Global South, and perpetuating that continues that practice. And if we really want to unsteal the sky, we have to remember these histories, but also return them to relevance. I think the last point we could maybe go into in the discussion is, how do these ideas change our understanding of space sustainability? Maybe from one that is based on development to one that's based on environmental preservation instead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this very inspiring and thought-provoking input that you gave us. I think you managed really well to tie together the old ideas that sort of brought about the emergence of outer space law and then what's done with them in the aftermath. And I think a lot can be learned from taking those historical perspectives and looking at a subject which is, at least in my experience, frequently only looked at from a very limited and very specific point of view.
Yeah. And in fact, I just want to mention, when I was doing this research, specifically reading the UN archives, that part of it, the space powers spoke first and at length. So actually, physically, most of it was scrolling past all of the histories that we focused on so much to go to the end of the document, which is where all the interesting stuff was that we've forgotten.
All right, so we have our first question, or at least notification of a wish to post one question or a comment in person by Timyebi Aganaba. I will briefly enable your ability to unmute your mic. Just give me a second. You should now be able to talk, Timyebi. So,
hello, good afternoon.
Hi.
That was a fantastic presentation. I really learned a lot and was really especially touched by your point, which I just tweeted out actually, that Article 1, half of it is seen as a rule and the other half is seen as a principle. And then you kind of touched on that there's a difference, but can you talk about the implications of having one provision that has both those features? Thank you.
Yeah. I want to mention Timyebi's written on this before and has a really good PhD and paper about the nesting of those nested provisions, which is another fascinating way to read them. I think because those are in one provision, they were meant to be a balance in time. This is something that was discussed heavily in terms of creating a balance of rights and freedoms on purpose. But to have them separately may have been, the fact that it is a balance, that it all is in one article, I think is what draws that tension, but also is what makes that promise possible. We don't talk about Article 9 and Article 1 in contestation with each other very often, for instance. They seem to be discussing different things. And so I think having them all in one place originally would have been a way of sort of making it clear which values were most important, as the first article of a treaty usually does. I want to mention one of the reasons one is read as a rule and one as a principle is based, you can see this right in the congressional record after when US was debating ratification, is they said, well, we don't think this equity thing is self-executing. which is an American concept that discusses the introduction of American law, international law to America. And that's how we've globalized this idea. It's an idea that literally is applying American legal discussion to the rest of the world without thinking. Yeah, so, and to be explicit there, the point of self-execution is that Al Gore Sr. actually thought that this provision wasn't immediate and clear enough to create a rule on its own. Some other states may disagree. In fact, the Latin American states who argued based on principles probably would. Did I get to your question? I'm sorry, I sort of.
Yes, yes, you did. And it's an interesting point because, you know, I think what I'm trying to say is what is the implication of that for people who want to rely on that? So, you know.
Yeah, so I'm gonna, in that case, reply with a quote from the Mexican representative to Unquapos in 63. He said, we're not careful, we're gonna end up with a law that doesn't match the facts, and a law that is so based on exceptions and rules and Roman law concepts and presumptions that it separates itself from justice itself. That if, quote, if we let time pass and let world rivalries consolidate in space, we will have an international law which is as imperfect as that which we have in the world today. Again, they very much saw this coming and said, we need to make sure, this is why the Global South was so naturalist or positive, anti-positivist, is we need to make sure that we're centering justice here because we're not going to be up there for a while. You will. We still need to make sure that equity reigns. And as yeah, so the implications are pretty much the future they foresaw.
Thanks, Chris, for taking this question. We have another one by Valerie Osterveld. She posted a one, so I'm going to promote her quickly to a panelist so that she can raise the question in person. Valerie should now have the opportunity to join us as a panelist.
Thank you very much. Chris, this was fantastic and so very interesting. My question is, you raised such interesting points about the historical voices of Global South countries. And I'm wondering, what do we make then? So you've raised really interesting points about what we need to be considering today as a result of those past voices. But what do we make of those voices that were not heard historically and are not being heard today, such as Indigenous voices with respect to space and equity?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. So it is really important because the Global South contingent at the UN Space Debates was pretty much an even mix of people with PhDs in the global commons and people currently committing genocide on Indigenous people in their own countries. And that's not limited to the Global South either. But it is something we need to be aware of, is that those voices weren't heard. There's some great work being done now trying to re-acknowledge the fact of different epistemologies or ways of knowing space. Natalie B. Trevino is just one example, who I know a lot of us have read. Elena Sirkovich is another, really talking about not just, hey, this Indigenous people has a cosmic understanding of space in a different way, but also making sure that we understand that that's not a lesser way of knowing, that in a lot of cases, most cases, Indigenous people were the first environmentalists and the first to really adopt the preservation standard, also the first to adopt the communal rights standard. All of these things are progressions we're only now making today in sort of the global international community, if we can put that with air quotes. I think it starts from understanding that different ways of knowing are equal to our own, and really trying to center that, trying to make sure, I mean, Indigenous peoples are trying to share their views on space. It's not like somebody has to go into the middle of nowhere and ask them. There are pretty explicit sort of representation examples going on here. It's more about hearing and amplifying them, I think. Because of the way that I adopted my framework, it was hard to do so because I'm really looking at 50s and 60s specifically. But I hope to do a lot more of that in the future when I get to the now if this becomes a PhD, basically.
Thanks. And it should become a PhD. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Okay. Since there are no further questions in the chat as of yet, but I would encourage the audience to post further questions if you have them. I would sort of misuse my position as a moderator to maybe ask a question myself, and that question would be, I think the perspective that you've taken, Christian, is very much in line with third world approaches to international law, and I've thought about those approaches recently, and what I got to understand is that third world approaches to international law have a sort of ambiguous or ambiguous relation to the law itself. On the one hand, international law is blamed for a lot of problems and hierarchies and inequalities that persist and maybe are exacerbated by international law. Yet on the other hand, international law and maybe notions like sovereignty and other concepts that promise independence and equality are promoted as part of the solution. And I was wondering what would be your take on the question if international law has any role to play in overcoming maybe this divide that you identified between the powerful nations, the spacefaring nations in the global north and the nations in the global south, which are voicing their opinions. They are making their opinion juris heard. So they're working within the system, but it doesn't seem to be enough. So does international law provide a system that helps, or do we need something else?
Okay, I have two answers to this. The first is kind of an example. A lot of students in their International Law 101 class are given at least a citation to a reading called Instant Customary International Law. Bin Chang wrote about this, and the general kind of student understanding or widespread understanding is that the powerful states in space can make international custom in a very quick way because they're up there alone. But in fact, Chang was writing about the opposite. He was, of course, an anti-colonialist who was discussing the idea of the declaration of principles that had been voted on by a majority of global South countries, itself forming international law immediately, based on that momentum of global South states. You can see just in that idea, which is in most, if not every syllabus that I've come across, that idea alone is a case study of how international law can take an idea that is supposed to help the global South and sort of reassociate it, as Adam Gedeshu would say, to one that is in service to the kind of core or global North, or however you want to call that. But I guess in general, space is a really interesting case study for this, because it was at a time in which decolonization and third world approaches were exploding in their popularity. And when Pan-Africanism was in its heyday, and when Elias was running around, and when all these people were kind of on the scene and very much looking up to space in many examples. But also it was a time of great future forward thinking, of optimism. And because of that, I think it's worth continuing that now. Space has always been almost pathologically future focused. And I think the idea that international law has still room to grow in space means that we should perhaps look at it as a solution in this case, because the alternative is lawlessness. And we know who wins in anarchy. It's always the loudest voices. And we don't want necessarily that to become, we don't want a might is right situation.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you for taking this point. We have two more questionnaires in the chat, or three by now.
One more point. There is Marina. There's a reading on I think Ito talks recently, or Vocal Reichsbog it was, about law having sort of a deadline, a built-in obsolescence, a planned obsolescence, and I think maybe that's an idea we could take forward as well in space. The law we make, we don't have, just because now I'm proposing law as a solution doesn't mean we have to stick to that. Sorry.
No, thank you for bringing that up. I haven't read that so far, but it sounds very interesting, and I'm definitely going to have a look. I think Philip posted the one in the chat, and then we have 2 or 3 more questions after that.
Cool, thank you, Max, and thanks for a great presentation, Christian. Really, really interesting. I would have a question about the dichotomy you presented between, well, the global south and basically the well, leading nations in space, so to say. Would you say that already, like also now, there is this collective understanding of emerging and developing countries that, about the more commons-oriented interpretation of the first article? Or is it more diverse, like is the perspective more diverse now? And if so, who might be the, well, more outspoken governments that try to make this a topic now?
Yeah, so again, so far I've been sort of, my blinders, just as Max was saying, are very much more on history, and I hope to move on from there soon. But I think forgetting is a powerful thing, and it's had its effect on the discourse now. Brazil signed the Artemis Accords just the other day, and those are not necessarily, you know, signing away one's soul or an evil document by any means, but it's definitely subscribing to a different view of the commons, or to leadership by a country with a different view of the commons than Brazil's ever had before. Again, it was one of the proponents of this equity idea. India was once reporting in the Times of India on a daily basis about why we needed commons for all, and then went on to create the debris event everybody knows about. So in a sense, you know, the former proponents have become the less helpful. I think one of the problems here is that it's hard to diverge from a very US-centric world. It's not just a domination now of colonial ideas, but also an epistemological colonization, a way of knowing space that itself has been successful in taking over how not just it's governed, but how we kind of know it. I think, yeah, honestly, I haven't seen a lot of state-led examples forwarding the sort of histories I've talked about, which is a pity. I've seen a lot of individuals, academics, and even civil society talking about elements of this. I think part of it is also because it was subsumed into the common heritage of mankind literally months after the space treaty, and then the NIEO, the New International Economic Order, both of which are seen to have failed, and sort of the history of equity in space is kind of told in that term or in that framework rather than an ongoing mission. We tell that history episodically instead of as a narrative. So that was me dodging your question epically. I'm sorry, but I don't really know.
Well, you get the chance to take the next one head on, and it comes from Mariluna Frank. I will promote you in a second, so you should now be able to join us on the panel.
Okay, here I am. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the presentation. Very, very helpful and also very relevant for my own research. So I might come back to you at some point because I have some more questions. My first question now was more of a legal nature with regard to your solution proposals. Mm-hmm. If there were environmental rights in orbit, who would then be the rights holders? I mean, would that even be possible? Because there are no natural persons who could hold those environmental rights, I guess.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in talking about the right to orbit, there's kind of 4 different ways of understanding it from me anyways. And 3 of them are just the same as we understand right to environment in general, which is the rights to environment in a substantial sense, the rights to environment in a procedural sense, and that's more the Viasat case to bump into Valerie's question as well. Then the rights of environment, rivers having legal personality and such. I'm less a direct proponent of that just because I know how crazy my ideas sound already. So I want to make sure it's stepping upwards instead of going for the top right off the bat. And then there's the idea of a sort of normative citizenship kind of creation. Like is the value of the right just that it's justiciable, or does it create a sort of way of discussing political objectives in a term that specifically undermines the coloniality method, which is to make people extractable and to make land claimable and extractable after. Rights make objects into agents again and enable people to raise contestations in their own language. And there's been a lot of discussion about vernacularization as a way of the global South kind of getting empowered to transform rights in ways that are far from Geneva and New York and Vienna. I want to also point out that Viasat case, whether it succeeds or not, as a very interesting example of how even a justiciable right doesn't necessarily need, or even a right that is not justiciable can have an effect. Because in that case, it's not somebody claiming necessarily a right in that context, but that starting a conversation could enable cases like that in a much bigger sense. And I would have to point out, there's a very good article by Jacqueline Peel and Lynn as well, who talk about the global South kind of progress making in the right to environments. We focus a lot on agenda and the Kyobo cases and how that right's progressed, but the global South is doing a lot more interesting work, going again off of similar claims, even to what we see in space from before. So all of this is to say that a right to environments, the rights holders would probably be humanity itself if we're talking in a normative sense, and that's okay in a sense. If we start to talk in a very specific way, it would have to be somebody planning a project that was currently in danger because of space activities. I think part of this is we need to understand harm in space, because if something can prevent a development for decades in the future, a simple liability regime of two objects crashing directly into each other is a very myopic way of seeing how harm can happen, right? If we consider indirect harm, rights holders are a bit kind of larger in their scope, which would indeed include future peoples, as Max mentioned earlier. And again, by the way, that was something explicitly discussed by Mexico, Indonesia, and the Netherlands at the space debates. So in short, sorry, I rambled. Normatively, all of humanity in a specific context would very much depend, but probably specific space actors, unfortunately. I'd like that group to be as wide as possible.
So it could be like included in the common heritage principle that maybe like connected.
Yeah, I think everything I'm talking about are the pieces to that puzzle too. The only reason I avoid the CHM regime specifically is because, again, it's almost a sinkhole that draws you into the Moon Treaty discussion or the UNCLOS discussion, or again, eclipsing some history. But yeah, and again, part of this is we haven't seen any case law. Like that ITLOS advisory opinion is all we really have on that, or the 2019 Inter-American advisory opinion on rights to environment. But yeah, I think a significant issue is also just we don't understand space as part of the environment. So all of the discussion we're having now on Earth doesn't really feed back.
Yeah, thank you. I would have more questions, but I don't want to steal any time. So maybe I will really come back to you.
Let me just let's do that. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And general question, would you be willing to share your presentation, or is this planned?
Sure. It's sort of a bit more hastily made, but I have a paper based on this that I would also be willing to share as well.
But it's not yet published, or?
So it has to be kind of on a one-to-one basis, but yeah, the presentation for sure. And I think this is being recorded and uploaded too.
Oh yeah, true. Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
All right, since we moved to a more environmentalist perspective with that last question, let's maybe just stay with that topic for the next one, which has been raised by Valerie again. Let me briefly read it out. And she asks whether you could tell us a little bit more about the EIA case in the US District Courts you mentioned briefly in the presentation.
Yeah. I was just doing some research on that the other day. So it's an interesting one because it really not a U.S. lawyer, I should say. So I cum grana salis, but EIA has been increasingly seen as an international legal obligation for the commons in general. We can look at the nuclear weapons advisory opinion. We can look at the ITLOS advisory opinion. It's seen as something that needs to be done as part of due diligence if there is a risk of transboundary harm, and transboundary harm, again, has been understood as including the commons from the ILC articles onwards, and especially discussing the, Nicaragua v, which one was? San Juan River case, there we go, Costa Rica v Nicaragua. I think so international law is more or less clear in a sort of theoretical sense. There's still massive issues in terms of who has standing, who can claim, how would it be enforced. The beauty of a transboundary environmental disaster, don't quote me on that part, is that there's someone else on the other side that can sue. But obviously in space that becomes very problematic because again, harm is understood in a very specific way. The Viasat case in particular, from an international perspective, I'm suspicious of this categorical exclusion idea. Again, our understanding of due diligence has to change with our understanding of risk and science. That's something that the ITLOS advisory opinion found. The idea of it just being categorically excluded in permanence is very troubling to me. Also, the FCC's management of debris in general has been troubling to me. The value of an EIA is clear. Part of an EIA best practice kind of wise is public participation in decision making. We would potentially from an EIA get data that could be peer reviewed as opposed to just presented by satellite operators or would-be satellite operators. Also, we would have a much better understanding of, as different states become markets that are approving this, what is happening kind of in the environment you're trying to enter. Instead of it just being SpaceX and the others, it would be something we could look and see a landscape of. Finally, it's very important to mention the idea of compensation for environmental harm, which is an idea the ICJ is advancing more and more now. Basically, compensation is awarded on a holistic understanding of how much it would take to restore the environments, which in a debris context would be massively expensive if it was applied in that way, but also requires a causal direct link, so maybe not. But so basically what I'm saying is the main defense against doing an EIA is from industry seems to be it would be too expensive and a chilling effect on industry. But it seems more expensive to me to go without that. And I'm sure those purchasing insurance for the satellites are already spending quite a bit of money on that. Going back to the Viasat case specifically, I don't know exactly if it's going to succeed on the terms that I've presented on talking about space as an environment. That's NEPA seems pretty clearly kind of exclude space in general. Maybe it will succeed on claims of environmental damage on Earth, which is something that the Times of India was reporting in '63, by the way. Or maybe it could succeed on that dark skies issue, which to me is important, but also escaping the idea of environmental disputes entirely.
Right. With an eye on the time, I would suppose that we take 2 more questions. One was raised by Jessie Shingler, and she asked me to forward it to you. And then I see that Tim Yevi has indicated her wish to pose the question in person. Let's go in that order so that she can have the last word, so to say. But with an eye on the time, maybe it would be great if you could try to find an answer in like 1 or 2 minutes for these final 2 questions.
Searching for it.
Okay,
yeah.
So the question was, what, if any, role have you seen played by the permanent sovereignty principle in these discussions? And in general, was there a change in narrative or rhetoric by colonized countries as they achieved independence?
There was a change in narrative in the sense that, for instance, Kenya was talking about, we're in the space age now. We can do anything. Like the future is here. And independence for them was very much linked to these discussions in a discursive sense, I guess. Not so much in terms of how they discuss sovereignty, but they were pretty explicit then, the Global South, about mining, for instance, of resources was something they very actively discussed. So I talk more about space resources in an orbital context, but mining, of course, is important. The Global South was very much aware that would happen, again, having been sites for mining for decades, if not centuries. So kind of the idea of what sovereignty meant then was different from what it was now, or what it is now. The idea then is that it would be an international sovereignty issue, that if we went with all of us, we wouldn't be as at risk of screwing it up, essentially. And in that sense, whatever we mined would be dealt with under what a lot of people call the consortium, or a public trust kind of idea, which again has been a line advanced in Global South rights to environment cases.
All right, perfect. And then, Timiri, I will briefly upgrade you to a discussion participant so you can appear and talk to Chris in person.
Uh-oh.
So, maybe, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, perfect. So I think, Chris, you made a great point that the early global proponents become less helpful as they develop. And I would argue that that's because space has always been about and always will be about demonstrating power and superiority. So it makes sense that in the end, they end up taking on the positions of the hegemons. But what I really wanted to talk about here was that you basically argue that the alternative to international law is lawlessness. But what about the new trend of national laws, which basically essentially apply to the most likely actors in space anyway?
Yeah, in a way, this is both a problem and a solution, because American law has dominated in ways that seem unfair, but also if we want to propose legal solutions, it's only the laws of 2 or 3 countries that really need progression in order to solve a lot of issues. Again, America has jurisdiction over like 60% of active satellites. So the way that their law deals with that very much matters. It's a solution as long as there's no race to the bottom. And as long as different jurisdictions don't have very different ways of assessing standing and ability to use the law on a civil society basis, because again, those are the people that Valerie was asking about, indigenous peoples, but also the unrepresented so far throughout history. So yeah, national law can be a great solution in the meantime, especially because it's more likely to be heard than international law in several dualist countries.
Thank you. Great job, Chris.
Thank you. Yeah.
I can only agree, Chris. It has been a pleasure talking to you. And I believe it was actually one of the most engaging sessions that we've had so far. So also, I want to extend my appreciation to the audience for engaging so actively and making this a session worthwhile. With that being said, I would like to wrap this up slowly and let you know about the next session, because the space sustainability talks will continue. Next week, we will talk to Professor Thomas Schildknecht, who will talk to us about the challenges and opportunities in the UN COPWA's working group on the long-term sustainability of outer space. So this is a very promising talk as well, and I hope to see many of you with us on next Monday at the same time. That being said, Chris, thank you once again for this absolutely wonderful session. This session will be recorded, so if anybody wants to check it out, you can find it on the YouTube channel of Sichtraum, of the network which is hosting this, and also on the website. And you can obviously also check out Christian's Twitter at ChrisVeik to stay in touch with him, which we will definitely do. So looking forward to that. And with that, I wish you all a happy rest of your Monday and see you next week.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.